Birju Shah is a professor of product management and generative AI at the Kellogg School of Management, and he is an avid farmer. Birju has managed large product, data, and engineering teams that built over 10 products used by 2 billion people worldwide, with an attributed total market cap of over $3 billion. He started his own organizations, and he's worked in large tech companies in their early and mature stages, and he's transformed various commercial organizations via private equity buyouts. His approach to launching and evolving products begins with the foundation of data-driven decision-making focused on achieving large outcomes through digital transformation. So most recently, Birju is the head of healthcare product at Uber, which is a job that he left recently to start his own concern. And he's also a graduate of Northwestern University. And he has a bachelor BSc in industrial engineering and obtained his MBA from MIT Sloan School of Management, where he is a legatum and a McGovern scholar. That sounds very important. And I'm interested to hear more about what that is.
All right. No, so the MIT has awesome scholarships, but like Adam scholarship is you're supposed to develop a business for third world countries.
Oh wow.
I was building an electronic medical record for villages in rural India.
That's awesome. Awesome.
It was super cool. It was very, very accelerating and leapfrogging. And then the McGovern scholarship, they give to only three students across all of MIT schools, and it's just the three students that I think are the most entrepreneurial. So I have no idea if I deserve it or not.
You know, I went to MIT my freshman year.
I remember.
I should have stayed and done. You could do an MBA as an undergraduate, actually.
You can. You can. Yeah.
Didn't really know what at that time. Yeah, at Stanford they had a class like this as well. They called it design for like maximum affordability or something like this. And one of my classmates started this thing called D-Light. It's actually been pretty successful in India. It was one of the first sort of wind up lights, you know, that you can basically
awesome.
create. Yeah, lights. I'm dating myself now.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I love those classes because it kind of, you know, the affordability of things allows for the scale of things, which is just fantastic to like see those innovations get into market, right?
Yeah. But I mean, look how much India has changed even since 2007 when I graduated. I was just reading yesterday that like it's called Indo Air, one of the Indian airline companies, just made the largest single Airbus order ever.
Indigo, yeah. It was Indigo Airlines, largest Airbus. I mean, when I went to India in 2019, I felt like it was 1999 in the US. Right? It's just everyone is doing some sort of startup, some internet thing, and so I think it's really, really interesting that they're just rapidly going, and like they're at the application layer, they're at the app layer. The app's still solving things and defragmenting the market. Yeah. So I wonder if they're going to be a little bit left behind on the AI layer, but it's still pretty exciting. Yeah,
I'm sure they'll catch up eventually. Yeah. So anyway, man, great to have you here. Right? Hope that summer's treating you well in Chicago, and looking forward to the discussion. So first, I think it'd be great if you can introduce to people who are listening or watching this what you do, kind of your background. You know, as I said, I would have introduced you, but you know, happy to learn more about what you're working on. Also, for my own purposes, I think that probably things have changed in what you're working on since I last saw you.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. So I mean, I'll just give kind of a brief background. So and Daniel, you know this, so interject. But you know, I'm basically a healthcare and agriculture person by background. And really the third pillar there and kind of the solution oriented is I was an IoT guy, right? So I was originating a lot of IoT sensors, a lot of data off these sensors, which also includes phones. And then through that, I try to understand layers of anything, right? Layers of the world for mapping, layers of the human body for disease detection, layers for farm fields, for yield productivity. And as I understand those data layers, I think in this kind of world of biomarkers of what are those data layers telling me? Is there some predictive thing that I could do off of this biomarker? Is it trending towards diabetes? Is it trending towards lower soil quality or soil health? In the mapping world, is it trending to really big traffic bottlenecks, right? And those biomarkers then tell me really ideas and give me options of how to approach it, right? Is it still a data problem, or is there some therapeutic that I can apply to that biomarker to solve it? And that's been my background for the last 25 years. And so now what I'm doing is I started Loam, and Loam initially was onboarding as many acres as I could, every acre around the world, to try to get them to regenerative transition.
Mhm.
And regenerative transition, actually, a lot of farmers are actually farming pretty decent nowadays with education that's ramped up and really spread across the inches of the globe. Do they plant cover crops? Do they not do tillage? Do they spray less herbicides, fungicides, etc.? And regulations and subsidies across the government have actually led farmers towards this direction over the last decade. And then during COVID, this actually ramped up a lot. COVID was kind of a shock to the system, as well as some other global events like war in Eastern Europe that shocked the system of food supply. And the other thing happened where a lot of countries, their soil was very unproductive over the last 3 seasons. And so
Mhm.
this has been happening for a bit. And so we've been onboarding farmers slowly. We still have that line of business. And we're basically telling them that we're going to pay them dollars for their data. As we onboard farmers in every acre, we collect their machine data, we put it against a rules engine, and we say you qualify for this subsidy or this credit, right? And we
Oh.
say here's how much you can make, right?
So
Now,
you pay them for the data, and then you give them advice on how they can make more money
that's
with
right.
some subsidy. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And like our optimization function, our little linear algebra is like sustainability, right? In terms of trapping carbon to make your soil healthier from a
Mhm.
farming standpoint. But on the second side, it's also for kind of yield increase, right? So if your soil is healthier, you can see your yield increase, not in a season by season, but more in that equation of like over 5 or 7 years, which actually is the value of like the EBITDA of the farm. So I think farmers like that. But
Mhm.
what happened, as always in every startup land in this last year, is commodity prices shot up to the highest they have in 13 years.
Right.
And farming crop cycles follow like the sun cycle, right? Because like
Mhm.
the farmer's almanac, so every 13 years, crop prices shoot high. And so like I'll teach you all how to be like farming arbitrage day traders, right?
Yeah.
And so with that reality came reality for me as an entrepreneur. I called some of our top farmers that have 20,000 plus acres that really want to be good stewards, but they were pretty honest. They're saying, Birju, like commodity prices are really high. I have to shoot for yield this year, right?
Mhm.
And most farmers rent land, so they don't own the land, so they don't
Yeah.
have the asset value. They
Yeah.
need to get money out every season, and a couple seasons over a 30-year season period, because that's how much they farm.
Yeah.
That kind of makes their savings, right? And so it's interesting. Yeah.
So how does actually, I mean, I'm going to ask, how does the economics then of renting the farm work? And yeah, we do a little bit of work in the ag space. I was shocked to kind of like see how yield is just like the single metric that people care about quite a
That's
bit.
it. Yeah.
Do they, with a 30-year lease like that, do they finance it? So like some years they can't pay it, and other years they kill it and they've got great yields and then they pay it back. I mean, that must be a pretty roller coaster ride of running a business.
Yeah, the most common lease agreements are crop share agreements, right? So
Okay.
crop share agreements allow the landowner and the farmer to kind of be aligned and say that, we are going to split the revenue 50-50. Maybe even the landowner takes on the majority of the input cost or finances the farmer and the equipment itself. So there's usually a huge alignment with the farmer and the landowner on this. And then more recently, landowners started to understand that some farmers are very incentivized by making sure they have a lot of yield because their revenue depends on the crop. So then they start putting sustainability clauses in there to make sure their land is like long-term healthy, right?
Yeah, because if I'm a landowner, like I don't want one farmer to be there for 20 years and kill the land and then
That's right.
move
That's
on.
right.
Right. Yeah.
And then they always have kind of like revisiting agreements. Like it's hard to find farmers, right? Farmers are labor shortage everywhere, but farmers are like a significant labor shortage. Median age is 63 for most
Mhm.
farmers.
Yeah.
We really have a pipeline. It's like doctors. We don't actually have a pipeline of like next generation farmers,
Yeah.
especially for large crops.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit in this like kind of like a little crisis that we're going to have in farming. That's why you're seeing so much VC investment in automation here.
Yeah.
And when you see the VC investment in automation in agriculture, these robot tractors, robot weed pickers, etc., a ton of them are government contracts with it too, right? Because the governments itself, they understand that most of the food leads to animal feed, leads to other ethanol, leads to other things that run a majority of their GDP.
Right.
And so agriculture is kind of interesting in that sense. So there's these all large systems that are understanding this kind of breakdown that's happening of farmers that don't want to farm. This like we have unhealthy soil the way we farmed over the last 300 years, so it's not leading to yield and productivity. And the old school lease agreements that you're speaking of, they also led to that, right? The landowner versus the farmer just kind of bastardized the land with spraying any chemicals to get yield out.
Yeah.
So now it's getting smarter. But the economics are just like on a per acre level. let's just take corn as an example. It takes like $922 to farm an acre of corn, right?
For one season.
For one season, yeah. Depending, like let's say in the early 2000s, it was you were making $700 per acre, so you were losing 222. Now you're probably making 1,400, so now you're gaining $700 per acre, right?
Because the price is it's basically just a commodity in the market, right? Based on supply and demand, and you can have trading activity, but the cost associated to farming is the fuel, the time, the labor.
Number one is inputs, number two is equipment, and then number three is labor. So inputs are the cost of your seed, the cost of your fungicide, your nitrogen, etc. OEM equipment, there's only a couple players, John Deere being the biggest one of them, right? So those tractors are huge, they take a lot to maintain. And then labor is the third most cost, and that probably makes up 75% of the whole cost, right? And so you're seeing really interesting companies come out that are trying to do more farming as a service type thing, so you don't have to have these huge capex expenses that may shift the economics a little bit season to season. But at the same time, farming itself, you wait for 1 to 2 years over the course of 7 years for a higher commodity cycle in order to make profitability, and that's what's happening right now in that 13 years. And so the other way around it, Daniel, to really de-risk the whole situation of farming is you get a procurement contract. And so in a procurement contract with a direct company, let's just say you farm corn and you sell it to Frito-Lay. So Frito-Lay, the chip company, is buying corn for you directly for their corn products. They like it because they can put some more guardrails on it, data transparency, controlled operation. If they say they're non-GMO chip, if they say they're this low chemicals, they could say all that in their branding, right? They have kind of a set input supply for their forecasted demand of people buying chips, right? So that de-risks you from a commodity cycle as well as the financing cycle. It also allows you to potentially lock in contracts for your inputs earlier as a hedge. So you could think about buying kind of futures for inputs that allow you to kind of lower the cost, or future for gas or oil for larger agriculture operations. And so we actually moved to Loam. Our second business line was a procurement. We were looking at companies because the farmers we wanted to didn't want to move to regenerative. We started looking at procurement contracts, and I think you and I started talking about that, which is really asking companies that you procure a coffee bean for $2 a kilogram. Why don't you pay $2.02? And that 2 cents actually turns out to be $60 per carbon credit for the coffee farmer. So then the coffee farmer themselves are then truly incentivized to farm in a sustainable way. And that's called insetting, not offsetting, which insetting, in my belief, is way better because the whole supply chain gets up leveled.
Sure.
Carbon neutral.
It requires the farmer to actually make good on that promise, though, right? So there's a lot of
it's not easy, right? That $60 for the first couple of years is you have to install some sensors, you have to do some baseline measuring, you have to understand the delta. In typical carbon credits, you have to understand additionality, permanence, and other factors like that. Now, insetting doesn't have the requirement of these third-party methodologies. Meaning Vera and others don't have to certify it because it's insetting, it's within your own supply chain. So you just care about doing it because you just are a good steward, and maybe you'll market it. But it's your own supply chain, so it's only you caring about it. No one's really going to audit you. Hopefully you are, as a company, data transparent, so people see what you're doing. Starbucks is a great example of doing really good insetting work, but they don't really need any certification for it.
Right. Interesting. And then why isn't the United States and other governments trying to encourage people to go into farming like they encourage them to go into teaching or something like this? Like, why? I would think that like you have programs that like try to incentivize people to like go to good schools and are really well qualified to go like teach in the inner city and like create jobs that are at least somewhat competitive. Not where you're going to be stuck, not making any money whatsoever. It's good for society. Like you would also think that there's plenty of people out there willing to farm, right?
Farming's hard, right? Like the dimensionalities, we could talk for hours on this, but like the immigration laws at the Trump era, they hurt farming a lot, right? Because a lot of the actual labor of like picking grapes or lettuce or kale versus corn, which is big tractors, a lot of it was immigrant labor, right? And so that kind of took a huge cut in the labor force there. That was one. Two is that there a lot of the agriculture industry has moved into technology versus farming. So they're looking at more systems to build for scale to solve farming of the future. So a lot of these schools, there's a ton of schools, a lot of the Midwest schools, University of Illinois, University of Iowa, have great agriculture schools. Agriculture engineers are still one of my favorite engineers to date. They beat Stanford and MIT a lot of times. I mean, like you know what it is? They grew up, a lot of them grew up farming, so they roll up their sleeves and they're able to do, but they do think of like a whole system as they engineer, because farming is a year-long cycle with 50 different events and how you plant, spray, and harvest. So they're very good systems thinkers, and then boiling down to very good kind of jobs to be done problems. So they have this innately in them as they kind of engineer things and code things, which is really, really nice. So if you need someone that's not necessarily an abstract thinker, but a doer, ag engineers are the best. But then that's the third problem. Ag engineers are getting poached by Google and others. Right?
Oh, really?
Yeah. And like, so I'm not the only one that sees this. And so it's really bad. And then, this dynamic of, we've had agriculture subsidies globally in every country for a long, long time. But I think those agriculture subsidies have really gone toward landowners versus landowners that know how to farm, so they rent it to farmers. And so there's this dynamic of people that know how to farm, they just don't have equity and kind of upside. And so there's no real good incentive compared to all the alternatives out there, that if you're a farmer, what's your equity unless you're the landowner too. And so I think that needs to change. I think that equity aspect needs to change a lot, right?
I think that, had something to do with Marxism, some of those different concepts.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
History repeats itself.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's spot on. The kind of discussion we're having is that painting a little bit of a dire picture, but in the sense of, you're growing to 9 billion people by 2050. You're also trying to feed 3 billion people that are in shortage. As the world grows, the world eats more meat, which actually increases the amount of crops that you have to have by like 60%. It doesn't go lower necessarily, even though we see in some of these kind of Western markets and marketing, but it's not. The water usage goes up, the chemical usage goes up. So it's a huge problem. That's a global system problem that governments it's the number 2 subsidies for most governments is agriculture subsidies, both for atmospheric temperature and for soil temperature to keep the soil healthier. So those are the 2 things, earth core and earth atmosphere. And then the economics of it just have to change. Like it's surprising to me how little this is talked about, like at Davos, in the sense of just pure P&L of a farm. Like what's the P&L of a farm globally, and how do we just make it better? And then we dive into some of these stakeholders like banks in agriculture, private credit, finance a tractor, finance inputs. We're talking 10 to 15 to 20% interest rates. That's been like that. That was like that in 0% interest rate environments.
Wow. I mean, that just seems like, there's laws against that kind of stuff. Like it's basically usury.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's laws against it in a lot of places. A lot of farmers that farm, it's very entrepreneurial, it's very do-it-yourself. It's very much I can control my own business line, so that's why they do it, right? But at the same time, it's actually very risky for them most of the time. If they're seeking out new land, they're either collateralizing any land that they owned before, or their equipment, or their grain elevator, the crops that they have. Most of them don't like to do that, and most of them will take higher interest to not collateralize things, right? And so it's kind of at their will. And so I think financing, although it takes the form of subsidies as well, some of these private loans that has to change as well. The kind of credit in these industries, which is interesting. Yeah,
it's interesting. And then, so what do you think about this venture you're on and this journey with respect to the impact that you think that it can have on, the environment and sustainability? We use these words a lot.
We do.
And I think that, of course, if you read LinkedIn, which is, I don't know, it's fast becoming like the world newspaper, unfortunately, for the
world newspaper. Also, people say their birthday. They congratulate people on their birthday on LinkedIn now. So I think it's
becoming more like Facebook was 10 years ago, unfortunately. Right? But there's a lot of claims and not a lot of data, right? And I think recently there was just something released around the actual environmental impact of the agricultural industry, and where meat, particularly red meat, is by far the biggest impactor, right? And you just mentioned it before. people are eating more meat. As societies get wealthier, they tend to eat more meat, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, what's your honest personal outlook on this? I mean, you've got farmers who are barely making a living, so they're going to take what they need to take in order to, you know, put food on the table, right? And they're essentially going to grow what they need to grow in order to make money. And if that's what the populace demands, that's what's going to end up happening. Is there's going to be more meat production, and because in our industry, in the food industry, you talk a lot about meat substitutes and the technology behind that and things like this. But if people are just like, look, I don't want a meat substitute, I just want more meat, right? Like I want more meat, right? Forget about all this. And then the farmer will react to that. They will purchase it. They will create it. Yeah.
I mean, so like, this is why I love talking to you, right? Because in my head, everything is driven by consumerism still, and flavors and profiles and marketing, right? So to me, the consumer is the consumer. Changing the consumer behavior is not something that you and I should necessarily target. We should serve into, but then the companies have a responsibility, right? Because they're the ones serving it. Yeah. And then farmer honestly is all the way behind the picture, right? Like the iceberg of it, it's really the consumers deciding what they want, companies delivering what they want and how they get it to them. And underneath, it's really the distributors and the farmers and the food processors and the manufacturers that are just kind of told what to do to meet forecasted demand, right? Right. And so in my head, we've switched a little bit. We've pivoted it alone. Is that we've been working with companies to just take over their sustainability department. Period. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing that's going to happen is that there's going to be the government subsidies that'll maybe, especially countries that are in dire need, and especially as climate change, people truly realize like we need to trap some of the kind of carbon in the soil to make the soil healthier to lower atmospheric temperature. It'll solve 40 to 50% of the subsidy. The other 50% needs to be companies in setting, right? Mm. And the optimism I have is every company has come up and said by 2030, 2040, 2050, I want to be carbon neutral. The pessimism I have is that, everyone's strategy starts 7 years from now, not now, which is interesting. But then the second thing is it's not just carbon, right? You have to look holistic. You have to look at the water usage. You have to look at how carbon is sequestered, how long it's going to stay in the soil, what other things you have to do in there. You have to kind of change the way things are happening from a farm standpoint in terms of, do you use biochar? Do you use more algae? Do you use more natural things? So it's a really complex, biodiverse system that we live on this planet that enables a lot of things, right? Mm-hmm. So really from that, we've been taking over sustainability departments, and we've just actually been measuring. We've just been establishing context for companies, measuring their supply chain, everything from company travel to how they make their goods, their footprint in terms of how their consumers buy it, and kind of get this carbon metric for them. And then from that, we're using a lot of AI automation to really tell us like, okay, here's your total emissions, here's your total water usage. And then I think this is where most companies have gotten it wrong. They've built their own sustainability departments, and that means they can only do limited work, and they're not looking at the globe for the biggest opportunities for their supply chain. Mm-hmm. So once you get that baseline, once you understand what they could do internally as behavioral change and guard rules, the rest of it becomes also like, here's other projects that fit your supply chain to automate, and we could automate the due diligence now with a lot of things, and we could say these are the things that move the needle for you to be carbon neutral, use lower water, be more biodiverse within your supply chain. And we're doing this analysis, and just like 60% of the Fortune 1000 companies, if they change their insetting ways to handle less water, more biodiversity, and trap more carbon, it'll move the needle like 18% on the 1.5 degree change. Yep. And so it's actually quite interesting, right? Because that's private companies doing stuff, right? And so it's really just I think companies are starting to own up to the fact that this is not just profit, but profit plus sustainability, or it's not just yield, it's yield plus sustainability, right? And so I'm hoping that's why I'm positive on this stuff.
Well, particularly if you're a consumer product. Like I was listening to a podcast recently about a company that basically has a substitute for palm oil. It's very exciting actually, and
super exciting.
I don't know how well it works, right? I mean, supposedly it has a very similar amino acid composition, but I mean, palm oil is like in everything that we use, right? Even like shampoo and whatnot. And yeah, it's solving a problem for these companies, but because they've made these claims, they're like, look, we're going to be conflict palm oil free by 2030, and they're they've made zero progress, like no progress whatsoever.
Zero.
And so then there's a lot of demand for that. But then you have stuff like, I mean, some companies, they produce things that people can't live without, and so they have very little incentive to truly change, right? And particularly when the economic cycle is down, now we see it, I think, a lot. In 2023, it's just intensified. There's, the companies don't seem to be as engaged on this. They're like, look, I need to turn a profit because I have all these high interest rates and the banks almost went bankrupt, and people are just happy to have food they can afford at this point, like in the food industry.
That's right. And this is where our thinking and our pivot is that like you can't do sustainability as kind of like a cost center.
Yeah.
You have to do it as like unlocking enterprise value, right? And so like when you look at the P&L and supply chain, the only way you could truly do this is if you embed in and you start seeing like, okay, you emit more here, but also here's a cost saving opportunity for you too.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be cases where that's not true, like you're saying, right? But I think there's actually a lot of opportunity to do things more efficient, to do things more automated, to do things with a higher productivity and utilization, and also lower your emissions even, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's hard for everyone to like change their gas and oil powered plants to battery operated plants, right? And to have robots kind of in doing everything, right? And so it's all about like, you have to be pretty thoughtful of how you're approaching it. I think the difference is that for the last 40, 50 years, people have approached projects with just the economic IRR, right?
Yeah.
We're just starting to get used to people saying like, calculate the IRR, calculate the sustainability IRR, the carbon calculation, right? And I think just that thought exercise by everybody, if they actually do it, that's enough. Like that'll lead to people finding efficiencies in both aspects. And it might not be the trade-off that we're thinking, that it's going to lower the dollar, because the whole market is moving towards more lithium production, more kind of battery-oriented production, more of this insetting trapping mechanisms. And there's a free marketplace of carbon credits and biodiversity credits, right? That obviously tied to the ultimate metric of the planet dying, right? At some point, and that's a free market. And so the trend is here because that's happening. And so if you're a company CEO or a board member, you have to realize this unlocks opportunity for you. If you don't shift into this, this is actually where money can be made. There's revenue opportunities in that free marketplace. Hence, you have to start moving your supply chain now. If we bring it to food companies, Daniel, right? Like a lot of food companies, where they get their inputs, it's going to shift in the globe. Like if they get oranges from Florida, they have to go to Spain next year because the crop cycle this year was so bad that they're like, they have to find a new region for their farms and their inputs, and they have to think about their shipping costs and all that, right? And so I think a lot of these companies I've talked to, they've said like, we're kind of 7 years away. And there's always 1 or 2 people that are loud at the company, like, no, it's here now, guys. Like we have to look at all our inputs, right? All our farms globally. And we have to start looking at where the new regions they're going to farm, because climate change has changed all that, right? Yeah. So to me, people view that as sustainability as a cost center. But that example is that this is actually enterprise unlocking for the future of your forecasting and your demand, right? If you don't shift now, you're not going to get that value. Someone else is going to get that value because they've locked up that farm. And so I think that
it's like a land grab. It's like it's another homesteading in a way, right? But
it is
probably much more complicated legally than the original.
It is, and that's where blockchain try to promise. I still think has opportunity to promise some of these things around fast legal structures and the future of it. But that also, we hit a perfect storm this year in being able to do that, right? And so and the trust and the transparency of it. But blockchain different than crypto, right? Blockchain allows for parcels of land and parcels of data to be legally flowed from entity to entity, right? And that a lot of companies are building on top of. But the crypto side is what kind of bastardized the financing of all this over the last year, right?
Well, bad press.
Bad press, yeah. But no, I mean, like I'm optimistic about it. I think that we used to reference this metric in farming for corn farmers. The top corn farmer made 565 bushels per acre one season, and the average corn farmer makes 160 bushels per acre. So that's like a massive 400 bushel per acre difference, right? Yeah. But like the underlying story behind that is like that 565 bushel per acre farmer used like the best GMO, the most chemicals possible, probably turned like $1 per acre profit. And it was just like, it wasn't with the second optimizing equation of like health of the soil, right? And so That's what's interesting, right?
So is that true that I mean, of course, every case is different, but on balance, if you practice regenerative agriculture, you just have fewer costs of operating? Because I mean, again, I'm not a farmer, but I would think that if you have your land and if you own the land, fine. If you're crop sharing, well, then the upside is what you share, but the downside, you just want to limit the downside because it's not like you have a fixed cost of the lease. And then you would basically just say, well, look, I want to basically produce some sort of yield that I can sell at a reasonable price with minimal costs, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't know what the price is going to be of my bushel of corn. So if I can just basically reduce the cost of all my inputs in a maximal way, I stand a better chance of earning a profit, even if it's on a smaller number of bushels, right? Because essentially your whole profit is dependent upon like your cost per bushel. Yeah, like it's the margin.
I think it depends. I think full regenerative ag is actually a little deceiving, right? It's lower yield and higher cost. You're using a lot more machines. So like, the whole subsidy of corn and soy in the US 300 years ago led to corn and soy farms, led to big tractors, right? Led to these inputs that exist, right? And then we had a lot of industry spawn off from that, right? Everything from ethanol to kind of like palm oil things, corn oil things, sussman oil things, all these big subsidies led to these things, right? Big tractors compact soil the most. And when they compact soil, because they're so heavy, you have to do tillage the next year. And when you do tillage next year, all the soil, all the carbon releases. When you go fully regenerative, you are planting cover crops and you're not doing tillage, but that actually means you're doing more hand labor right now because there's not machines that are developed for kind of fully regenerative agriculture, which means just higher costs. The inputs itself, they're not readily available or scaled yet. So they're not at that last mile of distribution. So to get algae to put on your field that does awesome photosynthesis and traps more carbon and creates really healthy soil and is known to be great for your crop and potentially your yield, too hard to get. It's like super costly to get it to most farms that are in rural areas across the globe because it's just not spread out yet, right? And so there's a whole system that needs to get up level in order for regenerative ag to occur. So it's a journey, right? Like you do one thing, like plant a cover crop that's readily available in phase one, you trap more carbon in the soil, it's healthier for soil, chances are yield is going to increase. You change over from a GMO to non-GMO seed that allows you to spray less chemicals. That's a 3-year journey. The first 2 years, you're going to take a loss, right? And the third year, you may go up, but the land itself, the asset value of the land is actually higher. So kind of a complex system where landowner and farmer have to be aligned, but you have to realize like it's not just full regenerative. It is kind of steps on the journey if you're going to do couple the enterprise value as well as the actual like sustainability value. But no, I would say right now regenerative is pretty cost prohibitive for most farmers. That's why they need the subsidies. That's why they need the dollars for the data. That's why they all rely on carbon and biodiversity credits. That in the free market right before the crypto crash, really, carbon and biodiversity credits were selling $60 to $70 a pop. And now they're like at $2 and $5 respectively in agriculture. So that 60 or 70 farmers saw that and they're like, okay, this year is my year to go regenerative and pretty fully because I make more money off my data and good practices than I do on my crop and my yield, right? And then when it dropped, that it's the opposite, right?
And it really goes from year to year. Those subsidies aren't like, oh, you have to do this for 3 years in order to get it. It's just like
every year. Yeah. And it's the infrastructure bill in the US, and I feel like a lot of countries are already passed or passing similar ones. There's some amazing subsidies that are there for long term. Like there's $144 per acre in the US for farmers to farm more regenerative across multiple seasons. But $144 per acre every season is a very good subsidy, right? And
what's the size of a typical farm like that's run by a family or small company?
I mean, like if we're talking about row crop, corn and soy, maybe 1,500 acres on top and maybe more. There's a consolidation of large farms that are over 25,000 acres are really owned by like companies now at this point. A lot of the produce from the US comes from a place like Taylor Farms, who's really controlled a lot of the produce and the farming in the US, right? And so farming has had a lot of consolidation in farmland, right? And owning farmland and then farm operations in itself. Brazil, I think it's like 10 farmers that own all the corn and soy in Brazil, basically. It's 10 landowners, basically. And so when you go to their farms, you're seeing more like 1 million hectare farm with a gazillion fields owned by like one entity, right? And so it's funny because in the beginning of the season, you see like 1,000 John Deere tractors in a row in one area, all owned by one entity. But yeah, I mean, so like, you know, farming also has that top of the pyramid thing, that if you want it, you got to get the top people to change in order for the world to change. It's not really the small holders that are going to move the needle at all, right? The small holders will benefit from the top people changing, because then they get easy accessibility and lower cost of algae, biochar, things like that, because that's going to be more of the demand then, right? And so, yeah, that's really it. But you know, my big thing and like my shift in thinking has been just take over the sustainability departments in most of these companies, do their baseline of measurement for them and where they emit, find the enterprise value and insetting value for opportunity here, and then just start triggering global marketplaces for them where they can start making change faster instead of waiting 7 years, right?
And what kind of internal change management resistance do you have around that?
You know, I think it's again, like I think it's a ton. It's a sustainability department, a procurement department, a CFO, and then the CEO, right? And then there's like the smallest part about a company right now is the 5 people that care about sustainability. Most of the procurement departments, they're just kind of do your job, don't mess it up, and also foresee risk. Like if we're short on tomatoes and we're a pasta sauce company, you can't mess that up, right?
Right.
They're not really set up for risk intelligence, right? That's usually some other forecasting group. So multiple handoffs, multiple layers of bureaucracy, and potentially unclear person who's writing the check and saying, I'm going to commit to this. And then on top of that, it's not at the board level yet, right? It's the government has enforcing, and the board level is not saying you need a sustainability strategy. So that needs to be in there too, right? And so I think it's actually quite complicated process, but it's not complicated if you go to anybody at that company who said, hey, you have an 8% IRR and we could do things more sustainable 5% of the way.
Yep.
And so that's what we focus on right now, is really understanding how can you unlock enterprise value, meet the hurdle rate of a company, but then also move the needle on sustainability. And really now, with all the AI technologies that we've built and that have been out, and we've been using LLMs for a while, is that you can do this all in a couple of days. It's not a 7-year project. And I think that that's the miss a little bit of sustainability departments such ramping up over the last 5 years at companies, that they're not mining the world of data that exists globally in a borderless way that allows them to achieve their goals a lot easier with their P&L equation in mind, but then sustainability layered into that P&L, right?
Cool.
Yes.
And so you bring those algorithms and that technology to bear and solve that problem, but I mean, who's left there to manage and do the work?
Yeah, well, I mean, like the managing part is also interesting too, right? In terms of, to me, it depends on your insetting approach, right? But let's just say at the farm level, you are putting we're putting sensors in with partners, and we're putting data transparency, and they're getting the data visualization reports pretty regularly. So then all the data is basically served to them, because most of these companies at these other layers in their supply chain, they're not truly verticalized, right? And so like, even if you're like M&M Mars, you're not necessarily verticalized all the way to the farm. You have a procurement contract to a farm that makes it look like you're verticalized, but you're not. So you just need the data transparency that things are being done, and you need the monitor and auditing that things are being done. So either you're going to do that internally or externally. So we can handle that, and we have partners that handle that, right? Now, if it's within your supply chain, manufacturing changes and things like that, you have to do that internally, right? And you have to have a team, tiger team to do that. But then that's where we kind of come in and we say, organizationally, here's how we benchmark other companies have done this, which there's a lot of examples in Europe that we'll leverage, and we'll kind of give them the playbook, but then they have to manage that, right? And then we'll give them the monitoring and auditing tools to make sure it's being done, but then also constantly check in to say your emissions this month versus last month versus the previous month. So the single outcome, the dashboards are there for them to actually track. Now who executes it, it just depends where in your supply chain you're executing, right?
Right. Interesting. Sounds great. How many people then do you have now?
So it's, you know, it's a very small team, but then with contractors, it's a big team. So it's like 20 people total. But I've also adapted to the way people want to work now at this point.
Have you found this to be the case as well? Is that basically people don't seem to want, not because they don't want to work, it's because they like the flexibility of not having a full-time job. I mean, I don't live in the corporate world too much. I mean, we have our own company. We're distributed also, like in the cloud. We have a lot of people working in different places, but you know, I see this in my wife's role. Like it's, you know, like the corporate world is just not seemingly a place that young people want to go. And I suspect that in the US, it's even worse. So it's even more rejected, right?
Yeah, I think it's so like a lot of our contractors want to work full time because of the mission of what we're doing.
Yeah.
Same time, there's like they want flexibility, they want to live wherever they want, which is complicated for me to pay them then. As well as like some of the younger ones don't care about healthcare and other overhead costs, which is one of the main sells of the company. They also don't really want to sign up to the IP stuff and the agreement stuff and all that stuff that relates to kind of losing a little bit of control. Now we have even stricter ones for our contractors to keep our IP, but I think they just seem to look at the employment agreements. They're like, this isn't me. And I wonder if that has to change a little bit, but no, I mean, we have it to a point we kept lean and flexible because of all the changes we've had, right? We were going from regenerative acres to then procurement acres to now we're just going to own sustainability departments because the market's changed so much. But then we're also just trying to find the power dynamic and what impacts the most. Right. And I think owning the sustainability department is every company wants a sustainability department or has one right now. They have a $2 to $3 million overhead if you're a Fortune 1000 company and salaries and FTE. If you're a small company, you can't afford the 100K overhead even. And so it just makes sense for a SaaS software to kind of do the work for you and take out this entire department that really can just focus on very niche things and not actually look very borderless and with a lot of data, right? So it's really interesting. Yeah.
That sounds great, especially if it's scalable.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're just talking about young people, Gen Z, and the next one as well. Do you think that, I mean, at the end of the day, going back to what you said, the consumer drives so much of how these corporations react. And of course, the consumer is also the voter, right? Which, you know, at least for the time being, you know, there's still functioning democracies, right? Like where the voters actually eventually get a politician that does what they want to do. Do you think this younger generation is going to continue to take that distance? They're going to say like, look, you know, my life is less about my retirement benefits and it's more about the impact I'm having. Because I really do believe that through generations, you know, 10 years, 15 years, that starts to make a massive difference in the way that companies behave. Companies are reacting to, at least in the food industry, they're reacting to who pays the grocery bill, which is like moms and dads that are years of my age, right? And so like, you know, we're ancient now, right? Like we grew up in a very different modus of thinking. Like my child, I will have a very different viewpoint on all of this stuff, right? And I don't know if it'll be productive, better or worse, but I think it will be different, right? And,
yeah, I think that like there's always going to be a foundational like necessity aspect, right? Like depending on where you are in your life, like what are the necessities and the needs that you have. But I think the problems you and I face is like we like excess, our generation likes excess and everything. And I think the problems are, I don't know if our kids will face this or our kids, I believe our kids will face it, is that there just won't be allowed to think in excess. Like I think that they're gonna have to think about the thing that I buy impacts a planet this way, because they're gonna be facing more allergies because the weather's hotter. They're gonna be facing more RSV viruses. They're gonna be facing things that, and I've seen in the last couple of years, the RSV increase has been crazy. And the allergy increase has been crazy because of temperature changes across the globe, right? When you study these patterns, you're like, you know, my kids are going to face larger problems than day to day. Like, what can I get more utility out of on my enjoyable life and in my private family? And so I think that I believe what you're saying, this generational, every 15 years, they get handed problems that they're going to have to solve. And I think that our kids are going to have to solve a larger problem than what their immediate families or immediate kind of day-to-day lives are going to need to be. And because of that, I think consumerism changes. I think consumerism changes with more of a populist mindset of maybe a more bipolar mindset, to be honest, too. Maybe some people truly deny it, like the earth is flat type people, right? And then there's the people that are like, no, this is actually happening because, you know, we can't farm in Florida anymore type thing. Right. And so I think that consumerism is going to take a very social approach in saying that like all products, instead of a calorie bag, they're also going to have like their sustainability calorie label on them, right? So I think I see that they're going to have to, I mean, that's where I'm trying to, like my son's 2-year-old, my daughter is 1-year-old. And I was like, how do I teach them about bigger problems right now? Like systems problems, right? But I think to your point that consumerism might take more of a groupthink approach generationally in the next generation. And I think that's just because there's gonna be big problems that they're gonna have to solve that we didn't have to solve. Whereas we went through industrialization and internet age, which was a little bit more about, just kind of flattening the world, efficiency, access, wealth creation type thing. And I think they're going to be more of a problem solving mode.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how wealthy you are if the air you breathe is really poor and things like this. I mean, I was actually recently in Brazil. My brother lives there. I had a great time. I thought the country was fantastic. But you talk to a lot of people there, and they're like, hey, they're asking about like, what's it like in Europe? Like, yeah, I think, like, could I move there? Like, and I'm like, guys, it's great here. But I think it's true. Like when you live in these environments where it doesn't matter how much protection you have or how many gates you have on your house, like you still live in an environment where, the everyday space is not great. And this is one thing I enjoy about Switzerland a lot, is like, you just walk outside and I'm like, yeah, I don't like need to have a fancy house. Like I just like,
you just enjoy it, right?
The park is nice, right? It's great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Park is nice and clean. You feel safe. The air still feels pretty good. All that stuff.
Yeah, and hopefully we can maintain it. But yeah, it does require a solidarity of the society where people, and that can switch really quickly. It can switch from being like, well, no one's really cooperating anymore, so now I'm going to look out for myself. And I think that this is a dangerous thing, right? And hopefully it can go back, from a sociological perspective, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like I look at like where I'm really optimistic about for our kids and the next generation, generational thinking, which I don't think we're going to solve the problems or the subsidies. I think we could maybe ideally create the right wedges for companies to shift when we're gone, for our kids to be our age and then take over, right? Is that the amount of teamwork being taught in schools, in the curriculums, the amount of like systems thinking and pattern thinking that's being taught in various schools is going to open up most of these individuals to start looking at bigger systems and patterns that realize that they have to change. I think that individual transaction layer is going to be less important to them and kind of their selfish lives, but then also in what they're solving for. They're going to see how that transaction aggregates up to a bigger impact. And so where I get optimistic is like I'm seeing schools, public schools, private schools, they're starting to get people like you and I come back to school and teach these things. And take the hate, right? I think the students that I have in Northwestern and Kellogg, I think some of them hate me, not for me. I think they hate me in a sense of, hey, your generation and your dad, they kind of screwed us.
Like I have not. I mean, I don't spend enough time around generations like that, I suppose, but I haven't felt that animosity actually. And
I get it.
Yeah,
I get it in school, right? So like 1,000 students a year is like what's going through my classes. I feel it. I feel that most of them know they have a window to work on fun things that they want to work on, and then they have to go into something important, whether it's the healthcare or whether climate related. And like the debates we have in class about this, they all feel pretty much that this was a generational problem handed to them that they're going to have to solve. If they don't solve it, it's the inflection point where the world just goes under type thing.
Yeah, right. Whereas when we were growing up, it was kind of like, yeah, like recycling's good. Like, it was like it was kind of like a cool thing. Like you get your mug. I remember when I first got to Dartmouth, you got your plastic mug that said reduce, reuse, recycle on it. I remember thinking to myself, like, yeah, it's a plastic mug.
It's kind of crazy, right? It's awesome. I mean, so I think the problem I have is that I think that maybe we are too much of a diagnostic generation for certain problems, and the next generation is going to have to be the therapeutic reactive generation, which is actually a lot harder to do, right? And so I'm curious where it's going to go, but I really do think that systems thinking, pattern thinking, allow them to see up level from the transaction of things that occur, that's going to change people's ability to socially kind of get together around the group think around consumerism, right? So then candy bar, now potentially people are going to be talking about the obesity factors, the sugar level, but also the unsustainable level of the way the ingredients came in there. And companies are going to have to shift to that, right? And that's really what's been happening across the board. And it's like you said, though, it's a fine line. It's a fine line for people to feel mentally like the world will be safe versus just thinking of themselves, right? Because actually it's going to be, and to be honest, I had more of my friends in San Francisco, like 100 couple friends that we were friends with. There's only 2 left because they're all in Switzerland and Portugal now. So I think that they are thinking a little bit in the sense of like, what's the safest place for my families and kids and the way that I want to live and where I want to go. And so like, I think that the selfish thinking is always going to be there, family first, right? And then kind of go up from there.
Yeah, it's hard to like teach your child to like hunt and kill in the jungle, but yet sort of feel like they're going to be safe when you're gone, right? Because, you know, you just don't want to think about, you know, anything bad happening to them, but sheltering them is not the answer either, right? So,
No, it's not. It's not. But you know, I feel like it's not the answer, but I feel like that's what our generation is doing a lot of to our kids right now.
yeah, I don't ascribe to that. I'm lucky to be married to a person who's even a little bit older than me and grew up in a country that was a little bit further behind the cycle than America. And yeah, I don't think we're too far into that. I notice it with my American friends. I'm just like shocked at the amount of like helicopter parenting they do and things like this. But I can understand in a society like America, right? Like you can fall through the cracks very easily there. Like no one really cares for you. So
yeah. I mean, it's a you know, I don't know if it's survival of the fittest or it's like the dog eat dog world here, but like you can get left behind pretty fast here.
Yeah.
And so like, and then you get stuck into carving your niche out, right? And trying to see if you can in your niche or reinventing yourself, which you can do here versus other places, right? Whereas other places are more socially set up to kind of let everyone kind of come up together as a society.
They move slower too, though. I mean,
That's
they
right.
have far less opportunities to like move quick, you know, be
That's
successful, make money, get places fast. But the trade-off is that there's systems in place to sort of look out for most people and make sure that they're prepared to deal with their situation when they get older and they grow up. Although, you know, every society is strained, you know, populations grow, immigration is happening also here in Europe, right? And the faster it happens, the harder it is for those countries to assimilate those new people, right? So.
It's spot on. It's spot on. I'm just waiting for like, you know, like in the US, we have these parks and recreation departments in every state and locality and everything. I have a feeling we're gonna have like a sustainability carbon department in every city, in every government that's gonna be run by like pretty fun people that are also gonna have to deal with disasters and from a climate weather standpoint, which are gonna be different too. And so like I think the systems are gonna socially change no matter what country you're in if we're on the path that we're on. And so like this year was the highest emissions ever since we measured for almost every country.
Yeah, but it kind of makes sense, right? The population is growing. Like even if you have technology that reduces emissions per capita, the population is growing like crazy. Right?
It's going to be, I think it's going to be a new high for a while, for if not forever, right? If the population's growing and consumerism keeps the pace that it's keeping, right? And wealth is growing the way it is, and then we'll have some disruption events with wealth, but still it's going to keep growing just on that aspect. And so I think the question is like, how do we mitigate and how do we create therapeutics now, which is where the market's leaning, right?
Yeah. My son got this assignment in school. Like they went to some animal park, you know, like they have a lot of natural animal parks and stuff here. They're like more a natural habitat than a zoo. And still animals in a cage in a way, like a big cage, very big cage.
Yeah.
And then anyway, you know, then he had to like this assignment, like draw what you think like the environment of the lynx and the bear is going to be like in the future, right? And it was funny because, you know, like all these ideas come up not from him, but from like, you know, my wife or kids at school, like, yeah, you know, like you're gonna have like the drone flying over like the place where they're sitting and you're gonna have it's like they immediately think to stuff like non-natural stuff. They're like, I was really proud of him because he's like, oh no, like you're gonna have like small towns in the forest and in the mountains, and the animals are gonna have their place to live in these small kind of segregated environments.
Very cool.
Where and then the people can live in amongst them, right? I was like, yeah, that's better. Like, do you think the animal wants to live in like a bigger cage all the time? Like it's just funny that once you get on this trajectory, they start to see like, well, yeah, wild animals like belong in a zoo. Like that's where they live, right? Like it just doesn't make any sense. And I think it's kind of sad also that like that's even that topic. Yeah.
I mean, the amount of things that we've taken out of the natural environment and then put stuff in there has been our whole progression of our whole lives, right? So I love that he said that though. I love that he said it's going to be like a joint animal human town. You know, I love that. That's awesome.
I don't know if it's safe for the humans, but anyway.
I mean, like, you know, I think the humans are going to be in kind of like, you know, a gigantic protected wear if the bear bites.
The human can go in a cage because probably the human is better off. I mean, we all live in apartments; they're small. Like we can, and then we can have the animals roam around free outside. Right?
I feel like my suburban house is a cage. Right? It's the majority of time now is work from home. You know, I love that assignment though. It's a pretty cool assignment to see the future. You know, and then you start realizing, wow, this is really influenced by TV and like Star Trek and Star Wars and people just
absolutely. Like, you know, you probably like a lot of kids are thinking like and I'm sure he did it at first, I kind of encouraged him not to do it. Like what it's like to like be in the Mandalorian's, world or something like this, like all this stuff that's like totally artificial. But yeah, I think that's the future of the space. And yeah,
That's so interesting. It's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, like I think my kids, and then also what I've seen with like other kids that are a little bit older, is that they aren't necessarily taught biodiversity and nature and natural surroundings as much,
yeah,
and like natural environments. They're taught kind of like current state of what things are, and
yeah,
like things are going to be evolving to, with a lot of like machine layers on top, like like current systems being part of the future type thing, right?
yeah,
Where they don't really taught where like current systems should break, right?
yeah,
And so, and I think that's just like a lack of like big thinking outcome focus. It's like our biodiversity is crushed on the globe right now. Like we're losing bees like crazy. There's like insect species in the millions that have gone extinct. And like we don't know, we're not smart enough to know like what those insects have enabled for us as a globe. Like
yeah.
maybe it's one insect that, their insect poop is what creates the soil health. We have no idea, right?
Yeah, and it takes, whatever, it might even take 10 million years, but eventually then it actually has an inflection, right? And the amount of time that humans have been on the earth is so tiny in
So
comparison
tiny.
to total, yeah. So
It's so tiny. No, but yeah, I mean, like I think that I'm positive about all this stuff, in the sense of I think the systems are adapting to this already that I'm seeing. I think there's influential people like yourself, myself, that are in companies, but also engaged in school systems and other things that allow for that change to happen.
yeah,
And I think honestly, the government has actually made me happy, in the sense of the subsidies are coming and the incentives are understood. And like where they came from is from what I think is a proper GDP level. Like if things happen to our system, we're becoming a third world country because we don't have enough exports or enough to feed our society. And so, and that's actually fine. That's I think great. And I think if the second order impact of that is related to sustainability in terms of atmospheric temperature, I think that's great, right? But what I've seen work is you have to find the actual like economic value first before you get to the sustainable value. That's just the time that we're living in right now. And I think that everything about it is related to kind of consumers and growth patterns.
right, yeah. And you hope that the companies continue to invest in understanding those trends and try to not get ahead of them for their kind of like corporate gain, but go with them, because you can still influence direction or slow down progress with marketing and propaganda. Propaganda works, right?
Oh yeah, it totally works, right? Like
yeah,
crazy like simulation game that we live in for
yeah.
these like marketing messages to slow down a lot of things, right? No, it's absolutely true. Like absolutely true. And it's hilarious you said it, because like I think a majority of what we do when we talk to companies is see how slow they are moving and changing marketing positioning.
Yeah.
And they think they're fast, right? Based off what they think is a trend, what really is a fad. And they're changing marketing to fads versus long-term trends. And I always tell companies when we come in, I was just like, I don't think this is a trend. I was like, literally 20% of your farms produce 40% less yield this cycle. And your procurement department is in array, right? And then also there's been a couple of events that have led to risks, that have led to shortages, which you should have predicted, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, all these things are trends, they're not fads. Right? Like, and you have to find the layers of geopolitical trends. I think sustainability is its own row. You have to find economic trends. And as you get these trends on paper, that's how you reposition your marketing related to it. The fads are moment and hits, but they're not long-term sustainable for your enterprise value. And like, it's kind of hilarious. Yeah.
But if you're a public company, like you look about the quarter, right?
You look at the quarter. Yeah, you look at the quarter, which is the hardest part, is trying to find value in the quarter to quarter, not the kind of 7-year cycle, right? And so I think, it's been interesting. But the Gen Z consumer, kind of tying it back to what you're saying, is like they want more. I mean, like I saw a travel website that launched that said like I think Expedia or these big platforms, they charge a 10% travel agent fee. And this other company launched that said, we'll take that 10% fee and like buy carbon offsets for you. And like it's been the fastest ramp up of Gen Z people changing to travel websites. And so like, the signal's there, I think, right?
It only takes enough people. I mean, every revolution has its own form, right? Like, in the 18th century, there was people overthrowing kings, probably 100 years before that, no one could ever imagine that it could happen, right? So it's just like, things happen, and I think that, but it's the masses that organize around it. So you're right. I think it goes back to understanding, what makes the consumer's value proposition tick, right? And the decisions that they make. And
I wonder if we're going to repeat history though, and we'll go back to like a king-making society.
who would we choose?
I don't know. I mean, hopefully not Kanye.
yeah. I was just gonna say it's got to be somebody from LA, right?
It's probably it's going to be some social media athlete star mix.
Yeah. That's a whole nother topic we could get into that I won't, maybe not in the public forum. But anyway, listen, it was great talking to you. We actually went a bit over time, but hey, man, it's awesome to talk. And sounds like things are going great. And hope you enjoy the summer and keep in touch. Let us know.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Awesome talking. Thank you for inviting me. We'll talk soon.
Take care, Birju. Thanks. Bye.